If people wanted to prevent heart disease and other chronic diseases, what are the worst types of food people need to avoid eating, Doc?
Yeah, I think this is really the big question that people need to be thinking about. And ultimately, it all comes down to the foods that are causing insulin resistance. These are going to be our highly processed carbohydrates. These are going to be things like vegetable and seed oils, and really the what many people call the ultra processed foods in general.
Vegetables and seed oils. The American Heart Association has their stamp of approval on vegetable oils.
Yep.
And you're saying they're actually the opposite of heart health.
Yeah, very much so. And I tell people that these days. I say if it says heart healthy on it, it's probably not. We have gotten so far off the rails when it comes to what foods are good for our heart health and what foods are good for our overall health. And you look at organizations like the American Heart Association, and clearly the decisions that they are making are not primarily focused on people's health. I don't think it's really out of bounds to say that the financial interests have taken over the health promotion interest. And more so than the financial interest, it's also just this singular focus on cholesterol levels and what influence certain foods might have on our cholesterol levels that has dictated what they consider to be heart healthy. And the reality is that the relationship between the foods that we eat and our blood cholesterol levels is very variable. And what relationship that ultimately has on our heart health and our overall health is even more variable. So we've really lost the narrative. We've gotten more and more processed with the recommended foods, and we've gotten away from eating the whole real foods that are most beneficial to our overall health.
So the American Heart Association, Dr. Kate Shanahan calls them the biggest fake news propaganda organization in America. And to your point, I see the same thing. And it's confusing to people, right? Those who really want to get healthy, prevent heart disease, which is the number one killer in the United States. What is it, 695,000 people or so per year?
About that this year, yep.
Every 33 seconds or so, somebody's dying from heart disease here in the United States. And for most first world countries, heart disease is also the number one killer, right?
Correct.
And they want to get healthy. They're watching this podcast or listening to it. But then they have their conventional doctor who's saying, no. That canola oil, it's great for you. I mean, look at these studies from the American Heart Association. And they do have some studies, but to your point, who funds it? I mean, if you really go down that rabbit hole, you start to see the truth. But for the average person, they're not going to really do that. So how do you provide clarity to them and empower them to understand that, there's some authorities saying that these vegetable oils are healthy for you, but when you dig deeper, it's the opposite. The truth is actually the opposite.
Yeah, I really try and zoom out and give people the big picture. The American Heart Association has had this focus on these foods lowering cholesterol levels now for 70 years. And what's happened during that time is heart disease at least hasn't gotten any better, and by many metrics has gotten worse. And our overall health has clearly gotten worse while these recommendations are being given. So, whether I'm talking to patients or whether I'm talking to my colleague physicians, I try and get them to zoom out, step back, and just think about that for a minute. The American Heart Association declared war on heart disease in 1955, and we are losing that war. So why would we continue to put trust in the recommendations they're making if they haven't been able to solve this problem in 70 years? I guess the argument that you always get from the American Heart Association supporters is, well, people don't follow the advice, and that's why it isn't working. But look all around you. People are clearly following the advice. Our supermarkets are filled with these near food objects, is the term I like to use for them, that I've borrowed from a good friend. But they're filled with these, food-like substances that have the heart healthy label on them. These foods have clearly taken over, our consumption patterns. You can look at things like the types of fats that we consume today compared to 100 years ago. So people are adopting them, and they're not making heart disease any better. And, I largely agree with Kate Shanahan. I would maybe say that the American Diabetes Association is even in front of the American Heart Association in trying to sustain their business model, which is the more people with heart disease, the more people with diabetes that there are that are paying attention to their advice, that's how they judge the success of their organization. Instead of saying, we should have less people with heart disease, we should have less people with diabetes, and really we should be putting ourselves as an organization out of business if they were truly in the business of curing these diseases, which they're not.
Yeah, well said. So you mentioned the first foods or these processed carbs that are very insulinogenic. They spike insulin, glucose, and insulin levels. What's the issue with high levels of insulin as it pertains to heart disease?
Yeah, so there's a couple of issues with high insulin when it comes to heart disease. And, if we step back to the cholesterol question, I think probably the most meaningful impact that insulin has when it comes to heart disease is the effect that insulin has on cholesterol particles. And when we look at things like LDL cholesterol particles, insulin will shift those particles from the large, fluffy, or large buoyant particles that are not atherogenic, that are not involved in plaque formation, to the small, dense particles. The higher your insulin level is, the more insulin resistant you are, the more small, dense, atherogenic LDL particles that you're going to have. So that's one effect. Another effect is by promoting inflammation and causing injury to the blood vessel walls, we now allow these atherogenic small, dense particles to get into the blood vessel wall where they're not supposed to be, where they don't belong, and that's what stimulates this process of plaque formation. So insulin acts in a number of ways that promotes heart disease, and that's why our focus should be on lowering insulin if we want to prevent heart disease.
So insulin, of course, carbohydrates will give you the biggest insulin response. Processed carbohydrates will give you a bigger response than whole foods carbs, but they will all give you a glucose and insulin response. Then we have protein, which is more of a phase 2, smaller insulin response. What about fat, Doc? What is the insulin response from dietary fat?
It's essentially zero. And when you look at, many of us have probably seen the curves, the pictures of this, and you see the huge spike from glucose. You see a little bit of a spike from protein, like you mentioned, and you see no insulin response essentially from eating fat. And so, again, fat has been vilified in the diet when it comes to heart disease, and especially certain types of fats like saturated fats. And yet we see that they don't spike insulin and therefore do not cause these negative effects that the high insulin, the hyperinsulinemic state, and the insulin resistant state causes when it comes to heart disease.
So somebody watching right now or listening is saying, okay, you're telling me, Doc, that high levels of insulin from carbs are a problem. Fat does not really touch the dial on insulin. So these vegetable oils are fat. They are not going to raise insulin. Shouldn't they be safe? It goes against the point you just made that vegetable oils are bad for you. So in what way is vegetable oils bad for you if they're not spiking insulin?
Yeah, again, so vegetable oils, it turns out the high omega-6 content is pro-inflammatory. So again, it's going to cause this inflammation, this damage to the blood vessel walls, the lining of the blood vessel. And it turns out that while substituting vegetable and seed oils for saturated fat lowers your LDL cholesterol overall, it also, similar to the insulin resistant state, will shift your LDL particles to the smaller, denser particles. So we end up in a situation where we might have lower overall LDL cholesterol levels, but it's the worse type of the LDL cholesterol particles that we end up with.
That's the loophole, right? This lowers LDL, but you're missing the full picture here and all the nuances. And you just said, yeah, maybe it'll lower your LDL, but it lowers it to the point where the majority of your LDL are now the small sticky pattern B, and that is not good. So the vegetable oils, for those wondering, what are those? We have canola, corn, cottonseed, sunflower, soybean, safflower, rice bran, and grapeseed oils. Peanut oil is kind of in the middle there. If you go with peanut oil, at least this is from my research, unrefined is going to be better than refined, and you still want that in moderation. These are polyunsaturated fatty acids. Of course, the word poly means it has many of these double bonds, which make them really unstable, versus the saturated fats, no double bonds, monounsaturated fats, a single double bond. So the saturated fats would be things like butter, ghee, beef tallow, coconut oil. Monounsaturated would be olive oil, avocado oil. These are healthier fats, is what you're saying. These are going to actually prevent heart disease versus contribute to it.
Yeah, and as you went through the list of the oils there's actually a very interesting sort of, we'll call it a conundrum for the people that are so anti-saturated fat. Because coconut oil, that you never really hear of as a, from the people who believe in this theory, let's say, of the saturated fat, and they'll talk about animal fats, and yet they won't mention coconut oil. And coconut oil is actually the highest saturated fat oil that we consume. When you look at something like beef tallow or butter, in reality, most of the time, it's only about 40 to 50% saturated, and then it's about 40 or 50% monounsaturated, and you have very low levels of polyunsaturated fats in beef fat or in tallow. In beef tallow or butter. But you look at coconut oil, and coconut oil is about 95% saturated fat.
Very high.
And yet, the same people that tell you to avoid animal fats will tell you that coconut oil is good for your health. So it really makes no sense. Now, on the other end, all of those things like the sunflower and the safflower and the canola that you mentioned, these are going to be almost all polyunsaturated. Many of them are in the 70, 80% polyunsaturated. And polyunsaturated fats are unstable because of these double bonds, because of these unsaturated bonds. They're prone to oxidation. And again, we know this. When these fats exist outside of our body, when they're in the bottle, in your pantry, they go bad. They go rancid after a while. Whereas, many of us have had the example, perhaps, of our grandparents or our great-grandparents that would just leave the jar of tallow or bacon fat out on the shelf, out on the countertop, and it never went bad. It never went rancid. And we don't think about the same thing is happening inside of our body. The same oxidation process is what causes these polyunsaturated fats to be unstable, to be pro-inflammatory. And this is where we see all the trouble occurring.
Yeah, it's a great breakdown. When I was a kid, Philip, my mom worked at Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I think I probably shared this with you, but some of you don't know this who are watching and listening. And she would bring me home Kentucky Fried Chicken almost every night. And I was a happy kid eating fried food. Didn't know about this, of course, as a kid. And she did the best she can with, to make ends meet. And I love my mom. But some nights she would not bring home Kentucky Fried Chicken. I would be like, Mom, what's going on? Why don't you bring me some chicken? And she would say, I only bring you the chicken the first week they change the oil. They refry that canola oil up to 14 days until it turns so black. Then they change it. Then she'll bring me some chicken. 14 days. So it's already unstable. And then it's being refried and refried and refried. And you imagine what that's doing at the cellular level to our arteries. And that's your point. It's rusting us from the inside out.
Yeah. And, that was one of the primary reasons for adopting these polyunsaturated processed fats, because they could be used over and over. So if you're a food company, if you're a fast food restaurant, or even if you're a food manufacturer, these are the advantages that they have. It really was never about health. And then they tried to sort of back into the health claims around these oils, and conveniently the cholesterol hypothesis, the diet heart hypothesis came to prominence. And it kind of worked out well that they could point to these oils and say, look, they're lowering your LDL cholesterol. They must be a good thing, right? But it hasn't really panned out that way. And in our bodies, their effects end up being largely negative. And our bodies really don't know how to process these fats ultimately. They're not the fats that we evolved on as human beings, and they really directly interfere with our cellular machinery. You can get into the details of how these fats get processed by the mitochondria and the trouble that it causes, and how these fats get incorporated into our cell walls and change the actual structure of our cell walls, make them too stiff, and that leads to problems as well.
Yeah, that the cell membrane becomes too rigid, to your point. Good things cannot get in, bad things cannot get out, and then you have symptoms and eventually disease. The half-life of linoleic acid, which is the omega-6 fat, is about 680 days. That means, for those who don't understand that means if you remove them today, about 680 days later, half of these fats will still be around that membrane, that mitochondrial membrane, creating inflammation in your body. That's how dangerous they are. And the way that they're processed, if anybody wants to just Google how canola oil is made, you could see that it is an industrialized product that they add these detergents and chemical agents because it's already rancid and it stinks. They put it into a bottle. It's already, to your point, Doc, it's already rancid on that shelf, and then you heat it up and it becomes rancid even more. So don't take the hit. Swap to saturated fats and monounsaturated fats, and your heart's going to thank you for that, right?
Yeah, definitely. So I don't know anyone who's watched those videos that still eats these things. It's pretty scary what the process needs to be to make these things even palatable or edible. And then you go back and you look at the science as to how these oils got approved, introduced into the food supply. And what you really see is they only went as far as proving that these things don't kill you right away. They're not, truly poisonous in that sense. But they really didn't, maybe you can give them a pass and say they didn't think about it. I'm not so sure that's true, but, they didn't really look at the effects over time of consuming these oils on a regular basis. And that's really what we're seeing today. Now we have, a society where people are consuming these things from birth because they're in baby formula. Yeah. And we're really starting to see the effects on that. And, circling back to heart disease, that's what's been most scary to me as a heart surgeon now for 20 years, is seeing the shifting demographics of heart disease, seeing patients that are younger and younger ending up on my operating table because of the lifelong effects of consuming these oils and these highly processed carbohydrates in the processed food.
What's the youngest person you've had on your operating table?
I've had patients in their 30s on my operating table, and it's really become not that unusual of an occurrence. When I started my career as a heart surgeon 20 years ago, it was rare to have 50 or even 40-year-olds on the table. And today I routinely have 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds on the table. So that has been a very noticeable shift. And again, that's only over 20 years. And people talk about, maybe this is genetic. Yeah. Genetics don't change that quickly. It's clearly environmental issues. And, we can try and point to other things in the environment, but we really got to look at the food that we're eating first and foremost.
It's awful. Wow, 30 and 40-year-olds should not be in that position. And you're right. Our genes don't change in 20 years or, 50 years. With the foods that contribute to heart disease and that could help prevent heart disease, we discussed, we want to avoid high processed carbohydrates, stay away from things like high fructose corn syrup, anything that's processed carbs. and then the seed oils, which, typically they come packaged together, the processed carbs and the seed oils, so you could remove both. Any other foods we're missing that we want to avoid to reduce the risk of heart disease?
I think that really hits the high points. And you bring up an interesting point in this conversation in that these things are oftentimes combined. And so, you'll see a lot of debate about, well, which is it? Is it the carbs, the highly processed carbs? Is it the vegetable and seed oils? And in the end, it really becomes hard to separate those things because you really don't see one consumed without the other. You don't see populations, for instance, that are consuming huge amounts of vegetable and seed oils and they're not consuming the processed carbohydrates.
True.
You look at societies that have consumed non-processed carbohydrates in high amounts without the vegetable and seed oils, and some of them maintain good health. So I agree with a lot of people who say, well, it's not the carbohydrates themselves. But, again, these things always get combined, the highly processed carbohydrates and the vegetable and seed oils. And then we have the problem of once you become insulin resistant, now it's all carbohydrates that are going to be damaging to you. So if you're not insulin resistant and, you're athletic and you want to consume non-processed carbohydrates, you're probably going to be okay. But the reality is that most of us in society are not in that situation. We know the prevalence of insulin resistance is almost ubiquitous today. The studies that have shown 88%, 93% of people being, metabolically unhealthy. And so now even the non-processed carbohydrates become a problem.
Yeah, that's a fair point. We have guys like Paul Saladino, who I think, I've had him on the show. He's really smart and brilliant. He could have carbs, 200, 300 grams of carbs per day. He lives in Costa Rica. He's very active. He's very metabolically healthy, and he's thriving. But 88 to 93% of American adults, if they live that lifestyle, it would just add more gas to the fire, right? More fuel to the fire, and it would not be a good thing. With the seed oils and then the carbs, and we have a lot of different factors at play here, but something I learned from you, and I've been giving you credit when I've been lecturing, by the way, is that there's only one cause of heart disease. And I'd love for you to explain what that cause is. You explained a couple of things that contribute to that cause, but what is that one cause of heart disease?
Yeah, ultimately inflammation is really the one cause of heart disease. And then, we look at all these different factors that can lead to inflammation. So you can look at insulin resistance that we mentioned. You can look at smoking, which obviously contributes to heart disease. But where they all converge is ultimately at inflammation.
And is it the damage to the blood vessel lining from the inflammation that's the problem?
Okay. Exactly. So that damage to the blood vessel walls, to what we call the endothelium, the lining of the blood vessels, that's where all of these things converge that ultimately lead to heart disease. And again, when we look at the cholesterol question that always comes up, you cannot demonstrate negative effects from cholesterol without endothelial damage, without the inflammation, without the damage to the lining of the blood vessels. So study after study, and I've done a few talks reviewing all of this, where you look at studies that have compared the effects of endothelial damage, inflammation, insulin resistance. You can measure it in a few different ways. And you look at the effects of a high cholesterol level, and you see that the magnitude of those effects are nowhere close to each other. High cholesterol has very little magnitude effect. 1.3, 1.4x risk. And inflammation, insulin resistance, endothelial damage, depending on how you want to measure it, ends up having 6 to 10x risk associated with it. So again, this is where I step back and I try and get my colleagues to acknowledge this. say, okay, you want to focus on cholesterol, fine. We can argue all day about whether or not it really is a problem, but let's accept for a minute maybe it is a problem. Why are you still ignoring this much greater magnitude risk factor, this much greater magnitude problem?
So well said. One of the most common comments I get and questions I get on social media, I know it's the same thing for you, is I started doing keto or carnivore. I started eating more of these saturated fats. I started eating more cholesterol, and my cholesterol is high. It's 250, it's 300, and my doctor wants to put me on a statin. What should I do? And if it's a short response, I'll say, congrats. You probably feel a lot better. Like you should be proud of yourself that your cholesterol is higher. And then I'll go into a more nuanced answer and talk about, okay, there's a lot of moving parts here. And I want you to share, what are those moving parts? Besides just looking at total cholesterol or even just total LDL, what are all the moving parts that we need to consider to see if we are at risk of heart disease, to see if we do need to make some changes?
Yeah. So, when we focus on the cholesterol question, what I try and get people to understand is quality of cholesterol, not quantity of cholesterol. When you look at the data, the scientific studies around LDL cholesterol quantity, you do see an effect there. But you only see that effect in people who actually have poor quality cholesterol particles. And this is something that is only more recently recognized. It's only something that we've been able to measure more recently. So it kind of got lost, I would say, at the beginning of the cholesterol story. If you really go back and you look at some of the early data around cholesterol, you see that it was very mixed. We can go back to probably the most famous study is the Framingham risk, the Framingham cohort. And this was really the first large-scale study that suggested that there was an effect of blood cholesterol levels on heart disease risk. When you look at the data out of that first cohort of Framingham, so these are the people who were really studied back in the 1950s, 1960s, when insulin resistance was not as prevalent as it is today, you really see that there was a very small effect and only at people with excessively high cholesterol levels. And what we now recognize is that a lot of those people probably had a genetic cholesterol problem, what we call familial hypercholesterolemia. And people with what today are considered elevated LDL cholesterol levels, LDLs maybe around 150 to 200, there was no effect in the original Framingham cohort on heart disease with levels that were what they considered mildly elevated, but today we consider to be significantly elevated. And it's only in more recent data sets that you see an effect at these lower levels of LDL, like 150 to 200, because insulin resistance has become so prevalent that now all those people that have LDLs of 150 to 200 in the studies, the vast majority of them were insulin resistant. When you really go in and you separate out the patients who are not insulin resistant, we see that this LDL largely becomes meaningless unless you have very high levels like occurs with familial hypercholesterolemia.
Interesting. So it's very important to test our fasting insulin levels.
Yeah, I think really it's the most important blood test that we can get if we're really interested in our heart disease risk.
That's very telling, because most people don't look at an insulin marker as a heart disease metric. You're saying it's the most important metric to get done to assess heart disease risk.
Yeah, definitely so. And again, this isn't groundbreaking science. This was shown back in the 1970s, 1980s. When you look at the work of Gerald Reaven, for instance, before cholesterol kind of took over the narrative, he very clearly showed that almost every patient with atherosclerotic heart disease was hyperinsulinemic or insulin resistant. What I see in practice today, again, kind of circling back, when you look at the patients who end up on my operating table, a lot of them, maybe the majority of them today, don't have elevated LDL cholesterol levels. Again, probably the majority of my patients today that come to me ending up needing heart surgery have been on cholesterol-lowering medications for years, even decades, and yet they're still ending up on my operating table. And what gets missed consistently is insulin resistance. I rarely see a patient who comes to me for heart surgery that has had an insulin level checked. Many of them have had elevated hemoglobin A1Cs, again, for many years, for decades. And in a lot of cases, that hasn't been properly addressed. And this is what's leading people to the operating table. It's not their cholesterol, it's their insulin resistance that is leading them to the operating table.
If you're following a low carbohydrate, keto diet, or carnivore diet, this is one of the most important tips. I see a lot of people who struggle with keto and carnivore, and the reason they struggle is because they are losing too many electrolytes. They're becoming mineral depleted. Every cell in your body needs minerals to function, to produce energy, which helps you burn fat and feel good. My favorite minerals and electrolytes are from Beam Minerals. These are fulvic and humic compounds that are bioavailable, that have over 70 minerals in them. It tastes like water. They're carnivore friendly. Let me explain why. There are no anti-nutrients in them. It does not break a fast. As a matter of fact, it could support your fasting window. And it's been a game changer for my health, and I recommend it to all my students. Head over to beamminerals.com. Use the coupon code AZADI at checkout, my last name, A-Z-A-D-I at checkout, to get a nice discount. Beamminerals.com, coupon code is AZADI.
Powerful. Go get your fasting insulin done. You want to see that in the single digits. You reviewed my test results. I think mine was like 3.8 at the number 1 day of carnivore, and then similar on day 90. With the insulin part and the A1C, it's so important to get the fasting insulin and not just pay attention to the A1C, because your blood sugars could stay the same. That A1C could arguably stay the same for about 14 years. There was a Whitehall study that showed it took about 14 years of this of people who had insulin resistance. Year after year, their pancreas was just shuttling out insulin, keeping those blood sugars at bay. And then at a certain point, it just couldn't handle it anymore. And then boom, they're diagnosed with either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. So A1C, great metric, but insulin is what you want to get before any of that.
Yeah, and I would even go further today, because a fasting insulin level, it turns out, may not be enough, because there are people who have normal or low enough fasting insulin levels that are still insulin resistant. So you really want to get a good overall picture as to whether or not you're insulin resistant. And honestly, there isn't one test that shows this. This is where you really need to be working with a clinician that understands this. I most commonly today will use an insulin resistance score. My preferred lab test is what's called the LPIR score, the lipoprotein insulin resistance score. You can also, HOMA-IR, which is a calculation that you can do based off your fasting insulin and your fasting glucose levels, is a pretty decent surrogate. And looking at things like the triglyceride to HDL ratio, again, is a good surrogate marker of whether or not you're insulin resistant. But, the message here is you got to go deeper. I think that's really the main message I want to give to people, is that if all your doctor has checked is a fasting glucose level and said you're okay, or even if they've just checked the A1C and said you're okay, make sure they get the insulin at a minimum. Ideally, an insulin resistance score, an advanced lipid panel looking at the size of your particles. These are the blood tests you want to be getting. And then leading us into the next topic becomes, what's even better than just looking at the blood test? It's let's look at the blood vessels themselves and see if there's evidence of damage. And this is where the coronary artery calcium scan becomes so important as well.
I want to talk about that. I just want to follow up on the insulin and some of the things that I tell people to pay attention to. If you are in fact insulin resistant, is you feel tired after eating meals. Of course, you have extra belly weight. You have maybe brown patches around your armpit area, skin tags. If you skip a meal, you become hangry and irritable. I'm not saying these are 100% accurate, but they will give you clues if you have insulin resistance, and you might want to go deeper if you're experiencing those symptoms. And looking at postprandial glucose is a good metric as well, with either a continuous glucose monitor or like a finger prick. But you check your fasted glucose, you eat your meal, and then an hour later you check your glucose, 2 hours later you check your glucose. You want to see a good response. 2 hours later, you want your glucose levels to be closer to that baseline number that it was before you ate your meal. That's also a good way to kind of assess if your pancreas is doing a good job pumping out insulin.
Yeah, definitely so. All of these things, again, can be put together. And like I said, there really isn't one test. People are always asking, well, is there one test? And the answer is no, there isn't one test. Our bodies are very complex. And so to think that one value would be enough to really tell us all about our health is kind of foolhardy. And again, going back to the cholesterol thing, this is another issue I have with that narrative around just look at your LDL and that's going to tell you everything you need to know about heart health. To think that our bodies can be reduced to one number is really foolhardy. And you want an astute clinician, and you want to educate yourself and empower yourself to get the full picture, to understand this, and to really know what's going on inside your body.
It's worth it. It's your life that we're talking about here. It's your health. And Jim Rohn used to say, take care of your body. It's the only place you have to live, right?
Yep.
You don't want to be another statistic to heart disease or cancer or diabetes or whatever it is. We want to thrive. We want to feel good. And that's why you're here to talk about that. Calcium score, coronary artery calcium score, CSC. Talk about that. Would that be your favorite test to look at the health of our arteries?
Yeah, ultimately, if we want to know about heart disease, let's look at the blood vessels. Let's look at heart disease. So coronary artery calcium scans, for people who aren't familiar with them, very simple, non-invasive test. Literally takes about 5 minutes. They don't even need to put an IV in you. There's no dye involved. Radiation dose is pretty low, and the cost is usually pretty inexpensive.
Yeah, $100, $200 or so, somewhere around
usually,
there, depending on the state. Yeah,
I've seen it as cheap as $59.
Yeah, it's great.
So great investment in your health. And again, is it a perfect test? No. Is it the only test? No. But it's as good a screening test as we have. There are going to be some caveats to it. If you're very young, if you're a guy who's under 40, or if you're a woman who's under 50, that score should be 0. That doesn't mean, so understand that a 0 score at that age isn't a lifelong guarantee. You want to monitor it over time. But if your score is non-zero and you're a young man or a young woman, that's a major red flag. And so this is why, I now advocate for getting these tests younger and younger. The general advice is probably, guys at 40, women at 50 is a good age to get your first test. But if you have reasons to be concerned, if you've determined, for instance, that you're insulin resistant and you're a 25-year-old guy, go get that CAC scan, because if it's not 0, that should set off the major, major alarm bells. And like I said, I'm now seeing 30-year-olds that are ending up on my operating table. So there's a good chance in their 20s they had non-zero scores, and that could have been that early warning sign that could have changed their path, could have empowered them to change their ways and stay off of the operating table.
And it's cheap and quick, right? Why not do it? So could you explain what it's looking at? What is it? You said we want a score of 0, right? The power of 0.
Yeah.
What exactly is it looking for?
Yeah, so it is looking for calcium in the blood vessels of the heart. So we'll step back a little bit. We'll give sort of the basic anatomy lesson here. Your heart's a muscle, and it needs oxygen to work. It needs oxygen to keep it pumping. And of course, your heart is really your most active muscle. It never stops working until it does,
Right.
when you're in big trouble, until you die. So on the surface of the heart are the blood vessels that are supplying the oxygen to the actual muscle of the heart. And these are the blood vessels that we're interested in. They're called the coronary arteries. We have three major ones, and then there are smaller branches. And what the coronary artery calcium scan looks for is calcium in these blood vessels. And calcium is one of the hallmarks of the plaque that builds up in the blood vessel when we have inflammation, endothelial damage, like we talked about earlier. So by looking for calcium in these blood vessels, this is the early warning sign that damage is being done to your blood vessels, that this plaque is starting to form. And ideally, you want that score to be 0, meaning you have no calcium, no detectable calcium in your blood vessels. And if you have no detectable calcium, the chances of you having a cardiac event, like a heart attack, in the subsequent years is very, very low. Now, the younger you are, that sort of window of prediction is shorter. So if you're 70, for instance, and you have a 0 score, you can say within the next 10 years, it's going to be exceedingly low chance of you having a cardiac event. If you're 20 or 30, that window is probably only a couple of years. And so you can't, like I said, it's not a lifetime guarantee. You have to monitor it over time. You want to make sure it stays 0.
What's the difference between soft plaque and hard plaque in the arteries?
Yeah, so the term hard plaque really is referring to calcified plaque.
That's what the test is
And that's
looking
what
for.
the calcium scan is looking for. There is what we call non-calcified plaque, soft plaque, people will call it. And that isn't going to be detected by the coronary artery calcium scan. And that's why the calcium scan is not 100% predictive, but it's pretty good. It is rare to have a cardiac event without having any calcified plaque. It sometimes occurs, but it's pretty rare. So we can get a more advanced scan that will show us both the calcified and the non-calcified plaque. This would be what's called a coronary CT angiogram. Now that test is more involved. It is more expensive. It involves a higher radiation dose. They need to give you dye in the IV, which can be, can occasionally cause some issues. And so that test isn't really ready to be a screening test. The coronary artery calcium scan is the screening test because it avoids those other issues.
Great explanation. With the calcium scores, we have Eric, Keto 50, Eric, our friend, our mutual friend Eric, who has an interesting situation, and I want your thoughts on it. I know that he's been talking to you about this as well. He, of course, was very unhealthy, standard American diet, and then he went keto, carnivore, and his calcium score actually increased as a result, getting healthier. What is this inverted relationship we see with Eric and some people that go carnivore and do keto, where their score goes up when we would think it would either stay the same or drop? So what are we seeing there?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that can be going on in that situation. Number one, we need to acknowledge that diet isn't the only influencer of our heart health. And we need to look at things like stress, sleep,
environmental toxins.
Other environmental toxins, right. I talk to people these days about, inflammation can be coming from something like mold toxicity, heavy metal toxicity. We see things like chronic Lyme infection and autoimmune disorders that can be causing inflammation outside of the diet. Yeah. So if someone is in that situation where they've cleaned up their diet, and yet their calcium score is still going up, I want to figure out why. Now, there may be situations where what we're seeing is this non-calcified plaque that's becoming calcified plaque. And again, this is kind of controversial as to whether or not this is problematic. It's interesting because we have a lot of data that shows that people that are on statins tend to have faster progression of coronary calcium scores than people who are not on statins.
Wow.
And, you know, there has been this, I'll call it hypothesis put forward, that that's okay. That's a good thing because of this converting non-calcified plaque to calcified plaque. And the theory being that once the plaque is calcified, it's now stabilized and doesn't cause problems anymore. But we have this conflicting data that shows that the higher your calcium score is, the more at risk you are of having a cardiac event like a heart attack. And the faster your score is progressing, the more at risk you are of having a cardiac event. So it's, you know, it's a little bit of a hole in the statin theory. And because of this, there's kind of been this, you know, explanation put forward that, oh, it's actually okay if you have increased calcium scores when you're on statins, but it's dangerous if you have an increased calcium score and you're not on statins.
That sounds pretty stupid.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to me, but, you know, you'll see cardiologists on social media talking about this. And I always try and step back and say, wait, explain that to me again. How does that make sense to you? And somehow it makes sense to them, but it just doesn't make sense to me. So bottom line is, if your calcium score is continuing to increase and, you know, you really have a cleaned up diet, let's figure out what else is going on. Why is it continuing to increase?
Yeah, and that's what we were doing with Eric, right? He had a lot of underlying other things going on, environmental toxins, etc. What with statins? Is there any situation where you would recommend statins? And what are the main issues with statins?
Yeah, so there are situations where I recommend statins, and it really comes down to if you are insulin resistant and you have poor quality cholesterol and you have a lot of it, and you're not going to do anything to reverse the insulin resistance, then there's going to be some benefit to taking a statin. Now, that benefit is going to be a lot lower in magnitude than we're led to believe. And you're taking the trade-off of the negative long-term effects of being on statins. And again, we can't deny these. They're there. They're obvious even in the studies, and I think the studies underrepresent these because studies on statins tend to get cut off after a few years. They only look at them after 5 years, and maybe it takes longer for these things to show up. But even in the studies, there is definitely a trend towards increased insulin resistance in people that take statins for an extended period of time.
Interesting.
And very interesting because, as we said,
that's
insulin resistance is the major risk factor, is the driver of heart disease. So sure, maybe you're getting some benefit to lowering your cholesterol, but if you're causing insulin resistance, which is going to cause more risk of heart disease in the long term, this is why the data on statins is so disappointing when you look at it. Because, you know, if you're lowering your cholesterol that much and you're saying that cholesterol is the primary driver of heart disease, we should see dramatic effects from being on statins. We shouldn't be in a situation where statins have been the most widely prescribed class of medication now for decades, 20 plus years, and yet heart disease isn't going away. So in terms of, we were talking about the negative effects of statins, the biggest one that concerns me is the increased incidence in insulin resistance and diabetes in people that have been on statins for extended periods of time.
Well, I mean, the truth is, when I looked up the numbers, the statin industry made $15.3 billion last year, right? That's a lot of money. And I mean, why would they want us to know this truth? Like this goes again, that's going to put a big dent in their wallet when this truth comes out there. So I understand why they make a lot of money, but it's an evil way to do so. And that is an interesting thought process that, you know, there is a time and place for the statins if somebody's not willing to do the lifestyle changes and there's, you want to take it, but then long term, you have this opposite effect of it actually making the insulin resistance potentially worse. Inflammation is a common theme here with the problem that leads to heart disease, but other symptoms and diseases as well. What are some markers that we should be testing for inflammation?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to inflammation, probably the best marker is your CRP, your C-reactive protein level. And this is a kind of generalized inflammation marker. It really doesn't help you to pinpoint where the inflammation might be coming from, but it's a pretty good indicator of you have inflammation somewhere, and then you have to start doing the sort of detective work to figure out where it might be coming from. There are some other inflammation markers that we might look at on the general kind of inflammation scale. These are going to be things like your ESR, you'll see it called the erythrocyte sedimentation rate. And then we can look at things like ferritin. We can look at things like uric acid that reflect inflammation. And one other that I think is important and oftentimes gets missed is our homocysteine level. This is another underappreciated risk factor when it comes to heart disease. And so if your homocysteine level is elevated, that means that you're at increased risk for cardiovascular disease. And I put it in the inflammation-related category. It's not purely inflammation, but I think it's another very important marker for people to be looking at.
That's great. I hope everybody wrote those down. Go get it from your doctor. And if they're not willing to order it for you, find another doctor or practitioner that will, and you could order some labs on your own too. That's the cool thing about the world we live in these days.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on ApoB?
Yeah, so ApoB, it's, again, interesting that people have said, well, you know, people have kind of acknowledged, and by people, I guess I'm referring to the mainstream medical community. They've acknowledged that LDL is a lousy marker of risk. And so they said, oh, well, now we got ApoB, and this is a better marker of risk.
And can you explain ApoB, by the way, for those who don't know?
So ApoB is a protein that is on certain cholesterol-carrying particles, and it goes beyond LDL because ApoB is not only on LDL particles, but it's also on VLDL particles, importantly. And so ApoB has been put forth as a better marker of risk than LDL. And I acknowledge it is a better marker of risk than LDL, but that's a pretty low bar to set.
Than total LDL, you're saying.
Than total LDL.
But the particle sizes of LDL, you wouldn't. What would you say to that? Comparing ApoB to the particle sizes.
To the particle size, the particle size is going to be the better marker.
Okay.
But so ApoB is a better marker because it accounts for the VLDL. And again, the VLDL is the atherogenic particles. So we talked about how you have LDL, you have your large LDL, which is non-atherogenic, and then you have your small LDL, which is atherogenic. And then you can, if you keep going down that pathway, you now have your VLDLs, which are even more atherogenic. But the problem is that if your ApoB is elevated, it doesn't tell you, is it elevated because you have a lot of large LDL around, or is it elevated because you have a lot of VLDL and small dense LDL? And those are two very different situations. And this is why ApoB, I think, ultimately has the same issue that LDL does. That if that's all you know, you're not getting the complete picture.
Interesting. Great breakdown. So you're not, if you're doing all the other labs, the total cholesterol, HDL, triglycerides, LDL with the particles, the inflammatory markers, do you see even a need to even get the ApoB?
No, I really don't think it adds much, ultimately. You know, it sometimes becomes a freebie, you know, is usually what, if you're ordering that whole panel,
add it on.
You're going to get your ApoB in there anyway.
You're right.
But really, in the end, again, you want to know, is if your ApoB is it elevated because you're insulin resistant and you have a lot of small dense particles and you have a lot of VLDL, or is it elevated because you have a lot of large LDL particles, which is not going to be a problematic situation?
Great explanation. Okay, so you gave us so much already about the foods to avoid that lead to heart disease. You haven't mentioned red meat as a cause of heart disease, a cause of inflammation. And I would ask 100 people here in South Beach, does red meat lead to heart disease? And probably 85 of them will say, yes, limit or avoid red meat. Now we have the carnivore diet, which we're both big fans of, an abundance of red meat. What are your thoughts on red meat and the carnivore diet as it pertains to heart disease?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can flat out say that red meat does not cause heart disease. And we really have all of the evidence that you could want to show this. And yet, somehow, like you said, if you ask 100 people on the street, most of them, probably 90% of them, are going to tell you that red meat is bad for your heart health. But it's just simply not true. It's one of these myths that we just can't seem to undo no matter how much evidence we have. And we have all the evidence. We have the, meta-analyses, the randomized trials. We have all the stuff that you could want. And yet this myth just still continues to persist. And I think it's because of the non-scientific influences, the financial influences. Of course, when you're talking about red meat, you get into environmental concerns and ethical concerns and all of these other concerns that have nothing to do with your health. And that's what people need to keep in mind. This isn't about your health. This is about all these other things.
Diseases into dollars. That's what it's about. Then you have the argument, look at the blue zones. Dr. Ovadia, they eat low amounts of red meat and they have these longevity centenarians that are living a long life. What would you say to that?
There are a couple of things I would say to that. Some of them which YouTube might not allow, but, without getting vulgar, I guess. There are two issues when it comes to the blue zones. So the first thing at a high level we have to think about is, what are you comparing these blue zones to? And the comparison is always standard Western diet, standard American diet. What the people in the blue zones often do, and again, this is controversial as to whether or not this really happens, but they're eliminating processed food first and foremost. You look at these areas and they have low consumption of processed food. And so any diet that eliminates processed food or minimizes processed food is going to be better than the standard Western diet. And I acknowledge that a well-formulated vegan diet, let's call it the whole food plant-based diet, is going to be better than a Western diet. That doesn't mean it's the ideal diet. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that it was taking away the meat from the diet that led to the effects that we're seeing. It's taking away the processed food that leads to these effects. Red meat in isolation, I'm still waiting for anyone to show me the study that proves that it's bad. And it doesn't exist.
No.
And again, we know, we have, for instance, the very well done Cochrane review, the meta-analysis that was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine in 2019, showing that red meat consumption in and of itself was not in any way associated with poor cardiovascular outcomes.
Mm. And another thing with the blue zones, they have that we don't have here in general. They have community. They, enjoy each other's company. They practice a lot of gratitude, which I call vitamin G. There's a lot of factors that just not as simple as, the documentaries or your friends want to make it out to be.
And their consumption of animal protein was probably largely understated in the studies as well.
Yeah, fair.
We need to acknowledge that.
And a few of them consume a fair amount of sheep and goat dairy. And the benefits of that is that 30% of sheep and goat dairy are medium chain triglycerides. And what does that help you do? Produce ketones, uncouple mitochondria, and all the benefits that come with that. So there's a lot of moving parts with those blue zones. It's not about they're plant-based or mostly plant-based and you should do that to live over 100 years. It's not really the case. So carnivore, you're a fan of carnivore. You eat mostly meat, carnivore.
Correct. Yep.
100% carnivore or majority, like meat-based?
Yeah, I would put myself in the majority. Probably, if you look at my overall diet, 97, 98%, there might be an occasional non-meat food that sneaks in there once in a while.
Like, oh, this carrot got in there. Okay.
Yeah.
You're a heart surgeon.
Yep.
And you eat the majority of your diet is meat, 97% or so.
Yeah.
That speaks volumes to me.
Yeah, and I'm in the best shape of my life. By doing this, I've reversed my pre-diabetes. I've maintained and lost a large amount of weight. I feel my best every day. My metabolic health metrics on the blood all look great. And I have maintained a 0 coronary artery calcium score now for the 5 years that I've been checking it, despite having a LDL cholesterol level during most of that time that's been over 200.
Yeah, that's amazing. Speaking of carnivore, you recently hopped on a Zoom call with me and you went over my day 90 carnivore results. Or I should say my 90-day carnivore experiment that I did, where I did labs on day 1, labs on day 90, and Dr. Ovadia looked at the labs as it pertains to, my risk of a cardiovascular event, cardiovascular disease. And my LDL went to 350, total LDL, 350. Total cholesterol went over 400. However, my insulin was 3.8, 3.9. My C-reactive protein was under 0.5. My homocysteine was in the single digits. My A1C was, 5.2. So you came out of that, and I don't want to give it all away. I want everybody to watch that or listen to that episode because it'll be out by the time this is out. But you came out of that looking at my day 1 and then day 90 saying you were at low risk day 1 of heart disease, and then doing 90 days of carnivore, you lowered your risk is what you told me, even though my cholesterol was over 400 and LDL 350.
Yeah, and I've now seen many people, with those same types of results and demonstrate this over and over again. We can look at the cardiac risk calculators that, your doctor probably is paying attention to. And almost none of them actually incorporate LDL as one of the factors in that risk score. This is something else that really doesn't get talked about and acknowledged.
So what are they factoring into that calculator?
So depending on which calculator you're looking at, you're certainly going to have your age. You're going to have whether or not you have high blood pressure. You're going to have, in many of the calculators, the HDL cholesterol and or the triglycerides, but you're not going to have your LDL. Some of the other ones incorporate things like inflammation markers. The coronary artery calcium score is in one of them, which is probably what I would consider the best one of them. It's called the MESA, M-E-S-A, risk calculator. But again, LDL is really only in one of the risk scores, which is the American Heart Association risk score, is the only, I'll call it the only mainstream cardiac risk calculator that incorporates LDL. What I now have repeatedly seen in people that go on very low carb, keto, carnivore, kind of pick your flavor of it, is that they're, despite the fact that some of them, and again, this is an inconsistent finding, but some of them do have their LDL go up when they adopt these diets. And also important to understand that for many people, that's a transient increase. When you first shift to a low-carb diet, when you're losing a lot of weight, is oftentimes the situation that you see the LDL go up. And then for, I would say, the majority of the people, it kind of settles down. And when you look at long-term I'm going to say low carb because we don't have long-term carnivore studies. But when you look at longer-term low carb studies, you actually see that there's really no net effect on LDL when you look at the whole group. Some people it goes up a little bit temporarily. Most people it doesn't. Some people it goes down. There's probably even more factors involved than just the carbohydrates. You can look at types of fat that they're consuming and things like that,
Right.
and what their baselines were. But the net effect of low carbohydrate diets, and I would say carnivore is obviously the most extreme example of a low carbohydrate diet, is improvement in cardiac risk. In my private practice now, what I see, and again, this is now over multiple years with many, many patients, and what we're looking at, the most important metric that I'm looking at is that coronary artery calcium score, and is it going up over time? And for most people, despite being on large amounts of animal protein, their coronary artery calcium scores are not going up over time. And that, I think, is the most powerful predictor of risk that we really have.
Have you ever seen a situation where you've reviewed all the labs, they got all the labs, maybe like I did all my labs, the proper labs done, and everything looked spectacular, but then you do a coronary scan and there's a score of 100, 150. Have you seen that to be the case? And if you have, was that the damage that was caused before they made these dietary changes typically?
Well, that's always the question that comes up the first time you have the scan. And that's why I'm such a fan of repeating CAC scans over time. Because you're right, if you got the scan the first time and your score is not 0, you don't know when that damage occurred. So this is why it's so important. Okay, let's repeat that scan in a year and let's see, is it going up or not? Because if it's not going up, if it stays at that same level, we know that that person is at very low risk of a cardiac event.
Do you see it go down?
Yes, in some people.
I've seen it too.
I've seen it go down. And I always caution this statement because you'll see people online that claim that, they had a score of 400, let's say, and their score went to 0. I've honestly never seen that in my practice. I've seen it lower 15, 20%. And
it seems, I mean, I don't want to say it's impossible, but it seems physiologically impossible to do that.
I think it's pretty unlikely to heal that level of disease,
But you can get
but
certain
I think
percentages
you can
down.
get some
that's what I've
reversal
seen
down.
too.
And, I also always acknowledge that, if you get 2 scans done, even on the same machine, there's probably a 5 to 10% variance.
Good point.
Baked into that. And we have to acknowledge that. So, but I now have a few people in the practice who we've seen 15 to 20% lowering, and I've seen it persist, meaning that we're on their 3rd scan or their 4th scan,
That's
and
awesome.
It's staying low. So I do think it is possible to get some reversal. I think it's more important just to stop it from getting worse. And that's really the main goal that I work on with the patients in my practice, that whatever score you're coming to me with, let's just stop it from getting worse.
What about eggs? Before you got here today at the studio, I ate like 6 eggs for lunch, broke my fast with it, had a Bison Epic bar. And what's the truth behind eating eggs as it relates to heart disease? A lot of people talk about eggs being inflammatory, oxidizing in your body, creating inflammation. What are your thoughts on eggs, Doc?
Yeah, I think eggs are one of the most nutrient-dense foods that we can eat, and I think they are a positive thing for our overall health and for our heart health. Again, all of the societies or the influencers, the people online that will talk about eggs being harmful for our health, show me the studies,
Right.
show me the data. And again, we have many people like ourselves who are incorporating large amounts of eggs into our diets, and we just seem to be getting healthier.
Yeah.
So eggs, along with red meat, that have been continually vilified, it just doesn't hold up to scientific scrutiny, and it doesn't hold up to the increasing personal experiences that we see around this.
It's really what you're cooking the eggs in, and if you're putting it into an egg sandwich, that's the problem there when you combine the fat and the carbs. But yeah, to your point, I love eggs. I think it's a superfood. It's terrific for you. What are some of the common habits that people do regularly besides what we discussed? What are some of these bad habits that people do regularly that predict an early death?
Yeah, I think we can look at the other kind of key pillars of health. So we can look at something like activity, and people who aren't getting regular physical activity, that's certainly a negative predictor when it comes to health. We can look at things like sleep, and people that are chronically getting poor sleep. That's going to be a negative influence on your health. And stress is the other big one that I would point to. And if you have a lot of stress in your life that you're not managing in some way, and this really becomes probably the most difficult one because we don't have that quantification. We don't have that number that we can point to when it comes to your stress. There are things like HRV that people will point to, but we really don't have a good way of assessing how much stress you have in your life and what that effect is. Because some of us, deal with stress, I guess, in better ways, or, are able to mitigate the physiologic, kind of effects of stressful life. And others aren't, and every little stress becomes magnified. And again, we see it in the studies that those people are at increased risk of cardiovascular disease.
Hey, I want to just briefly interrupt the video you're watching to share something with you. One of my favorite companies that I use for health and longevity and biohacking is a company called BonCharge. And they have a whole range of incredible products, including the blue light blocking glasses you see me wear right now. But one of my favorite products from them is an infrared sauna blanket. Sauna blanket works by raising your heart rate to a workout or a training session. So you burn more calories while you're actually lying down and relaxing. Also, it's going to cause you to sweat. And one method of flushing out toxins from your body is through sweat. There's also one of my favorite benefits, this endorphin release. Every time I get out of the sauna blanket, I feel like I just got a 60-minute massage. So it's easy to set up. It's super convenient. Head over to boncharge.com/KetoCamp. And if you use the coupon code KetoCamp at checkout, you'll get 15% off your sauna blanket. And actually, any of their products are 15% off with that code. All right, let's get back to today's video.
There was a book that came out in the late 80s called Recovering the Soul from a medical doctor. His name is Dr. Larry Dossey. In that book, I remember reading it many years ago, and I have it somewhere back here. There was a study, and again, this was the late 80s, but I would argue that it's pretty accurate even in 2024. There was a study that showed they could predict that 85% of the time when Americans had their first heart attack, and it was between Monday morning between 8 and 9 a.m. because they were going to work, the job they hated, the stress, boom, heart attack. So that book emphasized how important it is to master stress, and you're saying here as well, it's important to master stress. And it's not necessarily that stress is bad. It's if we don't adapt to it, then it becomes bad. So stress could be very important for us to get stronger and build this hormetic ceiling. But if you're not adapting to it, then it becomes detrimental to us.
Yeah, clearly so. And, you always hear the examples of the so-called type A personality. Now, again, there's a lot that goes into that. People that are overly stressed and not handling it well tend to have other negative habits. They tend to eat worse. They tend to sleep worse.
Smoke.
And smoke and
alcohol, probably.
Yeah, alcohol and drugs and probably aren't, exercising to high level. So it all goes together. It becomes very difficult, again, to isolate out these factors. And that's why I tell people, it is kind of the whole package. And, even when it comes to something like diet, which is, in my mind, clearly the most important factor. But if you're eating an ideal diet, if you're a carnivore, but you're smoking and you're not active and you're not sleeping and you're stressed all the time, yeah, that probably isn't going to work out for you in the end.
So true. You mentioned exercise. What about cardio? Is cardio a waste of time for weight loss? And if so, why? And if people actually wanted to lose weight, what should they do?
Yeah. So what I would say about cardio is it may not be a waste of time per se, but it's certainly not the most efficient use of your time. And if time is a limiting factor on your activity, prioritize building and maintaining muscle, doing the resistance exercise first and foremost. Cardio is a very interesting dynamic because, first thing is there's clearly what we call that U-shaped curve where doing zero cardio is not good for your health. There are some concerns that doing excessive amounts of cardio is not good for your health. And this comes from studies that look at things like marathoners who have increased coronary artery calcium scores. And again, there's a lot that maybe goes into that. But ultimately, the people that I deal with, that I talk to, the patients in my practice, time is usually one of their limiting factors. And so what I tell them is if you only have a certain amount of time that you're going to dedicate to exercise, let's prioritize resistance exercise, because clearly building and maintaining muscle is one of the best predictors of not only how long you're going to live, but the quality of life that you're going to have. And then let's just work on getting more activity into your day. And that looks like, you take a break and you go for the 10-minute walk. After you have lunch, go for the, 10 to 20-minute walk. Go up the stairs instead of taking the elevator. These simple things that you can sprinkle throughout your day. When it comes to weight loss, yes, we have to acknowledge that the studies repeatedly show that cardio in and of itself is not going to be effective for weight loss. And that doesn't mean that it's bad. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It just, I think, ends up not being the priority that we've been told that it should be when it comes to your heart health. It's interesting. We call it cardio,
Yeah, it's true.
Which implies that it must be good for your health
Yeah.
or your heart. It must have something to do with your heart. And I think, again, this is something that we've gotten wrong in telling people that if you do the cardio, it's really going to take care of your heart health, because clearly it isn't in and of itself.
This is really fascinating. So, two options. Option one, and the goal here is to burn fat, lose weight, and to support heart health, cardiovascular health. So that's the goal. And out of these two options, which one will get you to that goal faster? Option one, jogging for an hour every day. Option two, sprinting maybe for 5 minutes, 3 times a week. Which option would be better
I'm clearly going to go with option two.
with the sprinting?
Yeah.
A lot less time, high intensity,
Yeah.
recover, much more bang for your buck. And that's so good to know because, you don't have to spend an hour every day jogging. Now, get your movement, like you said, get your steps in and all that's important.
Yeah.
But you don't have to spend an hour jogging.
Yeah. I think, when we look at cardio, I see, I guess, two mistakes that people make around it. Number one is you see the people that will go to the gym and do their hour or two on the treadmill or on the bike or whatever it is. And then they largely just sit around the rest of the day.
Yeah.
And they think that somehow that one block of activity is going to make up for all the other, inactive time that they spend in their day. And the second mistake that I see around cardio is people will go to the gym and they'll do their cardio session, and then on the way out, they're stopping at the smoothie bar and getting this sugar-laden,
fructose bomb,
high-calorie fructose bomb, or they hit Starbucks on the way out and they get their Frappuccino. And again, what the science has shown is that our bodies kind of compensate for the cardio on a, when you're looking at sort of the caloric balance, is that most people don't end up in a net caloric balance just by adding the cardio to their days.
It's so true. I used to own a CrossFit gym here in Miami many years ago, and we used to have the machines that would calculate how many calories you would burn. And I always thought that didn't make much sense to me, right? So people would say, Ben, I burned 567 calories during this hour session, because that's what the treadmill or whatever device showed. And I would think about it. I said, wait a minute. How many calories would you have burned if you didn't exercise, if you just sat on the couch for that hour? Of course, they would have burned a certain amount, because we were always burning calories. So we're not factoring that part. You didn't burn 567 calories. You probably burned like 130 extra. And then you have the donut or whatever it is, thinking that you have 567 calories of wiggle room, but in reality, you have like 130. And then you're kind of deceiving yourself here.
Yeah, definitely so. And again, when we get back to that trade-off when it comes to time, if you had spent that, and it usually doesn't need to be an hour, but if you'd spent that time building muscle, and now, that extra muscle is going to be burning the extra calories for 24 hours of your day instead of just the 1 hour that you were on the treadmill, that's the other place that we see that sort of argument break down.
Yeah, fair point. So go lift some weights, stop jogging, eat bacon, and sprint. Fair?
I think that's a great way to improve your heart health.
Coming from a heart surgeon. All right, a couple of things here as we land the plane, Doc. I'm writing a new book with Hay House called Metabolic Freedom, all about the metabolism and ways to achieve metabolic health, which we're designed to achieve. And this concept of metabolic freedom, essentially to me, is the concept of metabolic flexibility, how our metabolism is built to take whatever substrate is available, whether it's protein, carbs, or fat, or body fat, or heck, just oxygen, and use it for fuel and feel good. And I want to ask you, what are your 3 favorite ways to achieve this metabolic freedom concept?
Yeah, so I think number 1 is going to be eating less often. So, we get into the concept of fasting. And what I tell people is, you should eat less often because you're hungry less often. I don't think necessarily forcing yourself to fast is the right approach. So eat in a way that makes you hungry less often is really, I think, the best way that I've heard it said. Number 2, we just talked about, is building muscle, because, muscle gives you a buffer. If you are going to eat the carbohydrates, let's have that sugar that your body makes from those carbohydrates become glycogen that can be stored in your muscles, as opposed to becoming triglycerides that get stored in your fat cells. So eating less often, building muscle, and then I think the other key to metabolic flexibility is not being insulin resistant. And when we're not insulin resistant, yes, we are metabolically flexible. And so if you want to have some non-processed carbohydrates on an occasional basis, you're going to be able to, your body's going to be able to handle that and process those carbohydrates in a way that's not going to be harmful to you.
And those first 2 tips, eating less often and building lean muscle, help with insulin resistance. So it goes hand in hand.
Exactly.
It helps to reverse insulin resistance. You said eat less often, and I like that, because it's not necessarily about eating less, but eating less often. Not because you're forcing yourself, because naturally you're so satisfied and so metabolically healthy that you don't have to snack to sustain energy and feel good. Fasting, there was that recent headline that came out: fasting increases cardiovascular deaths by 91%. Could you touch upon that just a little bit?
Yeah, I think that study was such a ridiculous. There are so many things that we can get into, and honestly, I'm even already forgetting about some of the details because it was so.
Yeah,
ridiculous.
It was a questionnaire, first of all.
Yeah, it was a questionnaire. It looked at I want to say it was a surrogate marker. I think that was maybe one of the mTOR studies, but I can't remember. I get them all confused in my head, honestly, these ridiculous studies.
The biggest issue, well, first of all, don't fall for the headlines. I think that's an important lesson. The headlines don't mean fasting is bad or good. It could be either way. You want to look into the study, but it was a questionnaire. People don't remember what they ate, number one, and what were they eating during their window. They didn't put that into consideration as well. So you could disrupt the benefits from a fast by eating a whole bunch of seed oils and sugar and crappy food during the window. So the bottom line is you think that it's a bogus study. That's what I wanted to just
yeah. No, I think it's it was a ridiculous study, and to think that somehow eating less often is going to be bad for us is really just such a nonsensical concept.
So
it goes against our evolutionary history. It goes against all of the recent evidence we have in front of us. We talked a lot about the types of food that you eat. But again, when we look at the changes in our dietary patterns over the past 50 to 100 years, during which time our health has clearly worsened, what we see is not only are we eating more of this processed food, but we just eat more often in general. And that is clearly something that is damaging our health as well. Because even if you're going to eat, the horrible processed food and the carbohydrates and the vegetable and seed oils, your body will recover from that if you give it time. But what happens is because these foods are not satiating, because they make us more hungry in the end, and we end up eating more often. And so, you can look at the data that shows us that, the average American consumes calories somewhere between 8 and 10 times in a day. Yeah. And again, do the math. If you're asleep for 8 hours and you're consuming calories 10 times, you're eating every hour and a half to 2 hours, or drinking calories every hour and a half to 2 hours. And this in and of itself magnifies these problems, because you're never giving your body that chance to recover from the foods that you're eating.
Yeah, it's crazy. I love the analogy that Megan Ramos shared with me about trying to get work done and somebody keeps banging on your door every hour to disrupt you. It's like your body's trying to repair and get work done, but every time you snack, you keep distracting it and annoying it. My colleague, Dr. Don Klum, did a patient population study where a few hundred people in this survey, and he would have them all write down when they would consume something. So it could be a meal or a snack, but anytime it caused a glucose and insulin response. So any meal or any snack. And the average person was doing it 17 to 23 times per day, which pretty much every waking hour, they are raising glucose and insulin. And it's no wonder why 88% to 93% of American adults are unhealthy. It's insane. Before I ask you the last question, share with the audience where they could find you.
Yeah.
Get some sparkling water, and then share with the audience where they could find you, your website, book, and podcast.
Yeah, so the best place to find me is really iFixHearts everywhere. So all the social medias, I'm at iFixHearts. You can go to ifixhearts.com, which is my main website. And then the book, Stay Off My Operating Table. Really actually hard to fathom at this point that it's been out over 2 years, but really continues to do well. And I tell people that's the guide. That's the blueprint to stay healthy and stay off my operating table, which is the mission I'm on.
Yeah, such a great title. Every time I tell people about the name of your book, they're like, that's a fantastic name. Go get the book. We'll put it down below. We'll put your website and social media down below. Last question is about gratitude, which I call vitamin G, and all the amazing benefits that come with it. I want to ask you, Doc, what do you have vitamin G for today?
Honestly, what I have vitamin G for today is that I found this way of life, low carb, carnivore diets, and that I'm now able to help so many people to find that as well.
And you're doing an amazing job at that, my friend. I always learn from you, Philip. I love getting to spend time with you. We're going to go get some steak right now, by the way, a good carnivore meal. And I love how you show up and how you educate the world. And Philip and I, Dr. Bavadia and I will be at Hack Your Health, formerly named KetoCon in Austin. We'd love to see you there. HackYourHealth.com. Keto Camp 50 to get $50 off your ticket price.
If you enjoyed that conversation, be sure to watch this next interview I did with Dr. Robert Lufkin, all about heart disease, metabolic dysfunction, and how to burn fat.
Modern medicine is really treating the symptoms of them. These diseases, many of them share a common root cause that can be reversed